Margaret Evelyn Harrington had never expected her legacy to be questioned, least of all by her own blood. A retired diplomat and former professor of strategic communication at Georgetown, she had spent her life in rooms where decisions changed nations and where being invisible was a tactic, never a punishment. But on the day of her grandniece's wedding, it wasn't a global summit or classified briefing that left her reeling. It was the sudden, deafening realization that she had become irrelevant to the very people who shared her name. The ceremony had been hosted at the opulent Willard Intercontinental, a location she herself had financed, down to the final floral arrangement and the string quartet playing Vivaldi in the background. Yet when she arrived in her tailored navy dress, hand-sewn by a designer she'd mentored decades earlier, she was met not with honor but logistical dismissal, her place card tucked behind a towering marble column at the far end of the ballroom. There, she could see only slivers of the event, a twirl of a white gown, the glint of champagne glasses, muffled laughter, but no one noticed she was missing from the front. And that was the message. Her presence was now an afterthought, her contribution a given, her voice deemed too quaint for the curated narrative of her family's new generation. The irony wasn't lost on her. A woman who once stood toe-to-toe with ambassadors was now obstructed by architecture at her own family's celebration. But Margaret had long understood that silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. So she left the ballroom without a fuss, her exit unnoticed by the very people she had mentored, supported, and shielded for decades. She did not cry in the powder room or write passive-aggressive texts. Instead, she went home and opened a file labeled Continuity. For years, she'd been updating this file, the contingency plan every seasoned strategist keeps not for war, but for legacy. She reviewed her financial contributions to the event, wire transfers, invoices, vendor contracts, and with methodical precision contacted each point of transaction. Within 48 hours, pending payments were halted, auto transfers rescinded, and the trust accounts adjusted. The wedding, still basking in post-event euphoria, had not yet realized what was unraveling. But it would. Because while they saw an aging woman in pearls and patience, they had forgotten she had trained world leaders to read the room, anticipate betrayal, and reclaim power without raising her voice. In their attempt to minimize her, they had awakened the strategist. And in the weeks that followed, they would learn that family titles do not entitle anyone to unchecked access, especially not to the grace of a matriarch who had built her entire life on principle, not performance. The days that followed were not consumed with grief, but with quiet restoration. Margaret didn't seek to explain her departure. She let the silence stretch long enough to make others uncomfortable. That was the beauty of restraint. It revealed more than confrontation ever could. The family began calling, first with thinly veiled curiosity masked as concern, then with a rising note of panic as vendors began alerting them that final payments for the wedding hadn't cleared. Margaret let each voicemail accumulate like dead leaves on the porch, evidence of a season long overdue for raking. What they didn't know was that this moment had been years in the making. Long before the wedding invitation arrived, Margaret had noticed the shift. Family conversations that happened without her, decisions about holidays made before she was consulted, estate questions floated carelessly at dinner under the guise of helping her simplify. She had once dismissed them as generational blind spots, assuming grace would bridge the gap. But now she understood it wasn't ignorance, it was entitlement, and nothing dismantled entitlement like boundaries. So Margaret restructured everything. She removed her daughter Caroline from any co-signatory privileges, rerouted her estate through a private foundation, and established a philanthropic fund in her late husband's name that would operate independently of the family trust. Her granddaughter Rebecca, the bride who had practically vanished from her own celebration, received no direct updates. Margaret preferred her lesson to arrive in the form of consequence, not confrontation. Meanwhile, Boston's upper circles began to murmur. The wedding had been the talk of the season, but now the story had changed. Why had the matriarch who funded the affair vanished during the reception? Why were payments bouncing? And who had actually paid for the custom floral arch that collapsed halfway through the toasts? Margaret didn't need to fuel the gossip. The unanswered questions did the work for her. And yet, this wasn't a story of vengeance. It was a story of recalibration. She had no desire to ruin her family. She simply wanted to remind them that respect is not hereditary. It's earned and must be maintained. She began accepting invitations to events she'd previously declined, showing up in tailored suits, not soft sweaters. She engaged in panel discussions at the university again, reconnecting with students who once revered her as a pioneer in international negotiations. The woman they saw now was sharper than memory recalled, an elegant force who had simply been on pause, not decline. And Boston noticed. She began receiving handwritten notes from former colleagues, invites to speak, features in alumni publications. Meanwhile, back at her Beacon Hill home, she instructed her staff to box up everything Caroline had subtly tried to modernize over the past year, replacing the antique books, the Persian rugs, the framed photographs. No longer would her identity be redesigned under the guise of care. As for Rebecca, she sent no words. Not a thank you, not an apology, only silence. Until one envelope arrived 2 weeks later with a simple handwritten message. "Grandma, we miss you. Please come to Sunday dinner." No mention of the wedding, of the payments, of the marble column. Margaret held the note in her hand for a long moment before setting it on her desk beside her grandfather's silver cufflinks and her husband's watch, tokens of men who taught her how to read intention beneath words. That note wasn't a gesture of reconciliation. It was a tactical retreat. And Margaret, she wasn't interested in being welcomed back into a room she had built from the ground up only to be pushed into its shadows. Not yet. First, they needed to understand what legacy meant, not as inheritance, but as responsibility. And until they could, she would remain exactly where she needed to be, at the center of her own story, no longer waiting to be seen by the people who had made her invisible by choice. 3 Sundays passed before Margaret responded to Rebecca's invitation, not with words, but with action. She arrived at the family dinner precisely at 6, unannounced and unaccompanied, dressed in a charcoal gray suit tailored to perfection. Her presence in the entryway startled Caroline, who had not expected her mother to appear, much less with the bearing of someone ready to lead a boardroom negotiation. Margaret offered no hugs, no apologies, only a quiet nod and a glance at the dining room where the table was already set, for 5, not 6. "I see the head count hasn't changed," she remarked, without venom, just observation. Rebecca rushed in with a nervous smile. "We didn't know if you'd—" But her voice trailed off under Margaret's gaze. "Invite me or seat me?" Margaret asked plainly. The air stilled like it does before a downpour. She walked to the table and calmly pulled out the extra chair from the corner, placing it where the host usually sat. The message was clear. Caroline, always eager to regain control, poured wine with a too bright smile, commenting on the roast, the weather, anything to distract from the recalibration taking place. But the center of gravity had shifted. Margaret spoke little, but every time she did, the room fell quiet. She asked Rebecca about her honeymoon, Jackson about his new role at the firm, but she offered no anecdotes from her Tuscan escape. That part of her story was not theirs to share. Not yet. The dinner proceeded like a strained peace treaty, with small talk acting as fragile mortar. But Margaret had no intention of pretending. As dessert was served, she finally addressed the elephant they all had been tiptoeing around. "You know," she began, setting down her fork, It's interesting how easily family can mistake patience for passivity. You mistake age for apathy, and silence for surrender. Caroline's hand twitched slightly against her napkin. Mother, we never intended. That, Margaret interrupted gently, is precisely the problem. You never intended to diminish me. You simply did because it was convenient. She turned to Rebecca. You didn't mean to erase me from your wedding photos. You just never considered that I mattered enough to include. The words weren't angry. They were clinical, surgical in their truth. Jackson shifted uncomfortably but didn't interrupt. Rebecca's face flushed. I just wanted the wedding to be perfect, she whispered. Perfect is never about symmetry, my dear. It's about substance. It's about integrity. You cannot Photoshop legacy into a story you tried to exclude. Silence filled the room. Margaret stood, placing her napkin neatly on the table. I will not attend another family event where I am treated as a guest in the empire I built. If you want me there, you will make room for me before the guest list is printed, not after. With that, she left the dining room and the house, her heels clicking a slow, deliberate rhythm down the hallway. She didn't look back. At home, she poured herself a single glass of cognac and stood before the fireplace, staring at a photograph of her late husband. You'd be proud, she whispered. I finally stopped shrinking to fit into their expectations. She reflected not on the pain, but on the power of choosing clarity over compliance. That evening, she sat at her desk and wrote a letter, not to her family, but to the board of the Women's Leadership Foundation she had recently endowed. She announced a new initiative, the Column Fund, designed to support older women pushed to the margins in their own families, careers, or communities. It would offer legal advice, housing advocacy, and public speaking training. Because, she wrote, no woman who has built something of value should ever find herself seated behind a pillar of irrelevance at her own table. The next day, she received a call from Jackson. Would you consider lunch, just you and me? He asked. She paused, then replied, Yes, I believe you're ready for a different conversation. Margaret didn't just rewrite her legacy, she redefined what it meant to be truly seen. And in doing so, she lit a path for every woman who had ever been positioned quietly in the background of a moment she helped make possible. The lunch with Jackson was not just a meal, it was a reckoning. They met at a quiet bistro tucked away near Boston Common, the kind of place Margaret used to frequent with colleagues when she still lectured at Harvard. Jackson arrived early, nervous, respectful. He stood when she entered, pulling out her chair with an instinct he likely hadn't used since law school interviews. I asked to meet, he began, because I owe you more than an apology. Margaret waited. He continued, I watched my wife manipulate the people around her and ignored it. I thought it was harmless until I saw what it did to you. She studied him, not with judgment, but with the weight of someone who had seen generations of character tested. You were silent, she said softly. Silence is never neutral. It's permission. He nodded, chastened. I see that now, and I want to be better, not just for Rebecca, but because I've realized who I've married into and what that demands. Over roasted salmon and lemon risotto, they discussed legacy, not as inheritance, but as intentional structure. Jackson asked if he could volunteer legal expertise to the foundation. I want to help women like you build safeguards before they're blindsided, he said. Margaret agreed but warned, this won't absolve you, but it can begin to balance the scales. Meanwhile, Caroline and Rebecca were unraveling in private. The public story had been brutal. Rumors about Margaret's cancellation of the wedding payments had reached every social club and alumni circle in Boston. The version told was simple. The grandmother who funded the wedding was seated behind a column, and the next day, the money vanished. Even those who had once sided with Caroline now questioned her judgment, and Rebecca's reputation in the philanthropic circuit had taken a hit. And still, Margaret had said nothing publicly. She let the vacuum of her silence amplify their discomfort. That, she had learned, was the gift of maturity, not needing to argue, only to hold your ground until others ran out of excuses. The real shift came weeks later when Caroline arrived unannounced at Margaret's Beacon Hill home. She didn't knock. She waited outside like a penitent. Eleanor brought her in, hesitant but compassionate. "She's in the conservatory," Eleanor said softly. "She hasn't spoken about you, but she's spoken of healing." Caroline entered, aged not by time, but by the weight of self-awareness. "Mother," she said simply. Margaret looked up from her journal. "I see you've remembered how to find me." Caroline took a seat across from her. "I've been doing the work, with a therapist, and with myself. You were never weak, were you? You were patient, and we used that against you." Margaret closed her journal. "I let you believe I disappeared because I was tired of explaining my value to people who should have inherited it by example." Caroline wiped a tear. "I'm sorry, and I'm ready to repair. Not for your money, not for the trust, for me, because I don't want to be the kind of woman who teaches her daughter how to diminish another woman to feel powerful." For the first time in months, Margaret softened. Then let's start there. Over time, the repair became real. Rebecca joined the Foundation's mentorship program, not as a figurehead, but as an intern, answering phones and arranging events with no special treatment. The column incident had become a lesson, not just for her, but for every young woman who followed. Margaret began speaking publicly again, using her story to raise awareness about ageism and erasure. At a leadership forum, she ended her keynote with, "We must stop placing our elders behind pillars while building platforms for the inexperienced. Wisdom is not a wrinkle, it is a blueprint. Honor it." The audience stood in ovation. Margaret didn't smile for their approval. She smiled for her own, because finally the strategy had worked. Not to win back what was taken, but to ensure it could never be taken again. By the end of that year, Margaret Sullivan had not only rebuilt her own dignity, but rewritten the expectations of what aging in legacy meant. The Margaret Sullivan Foundation gained national attention when Harvard University announced a joint fellowship bearing her name, an honor recognizing her lifetime of leadership and her radical stand against internalized familial ageism. At the award ceremony, Margaret stood at the podium in a sapphire blue blazer that mirrored the family brooch still tucked in her handbag. She didn't wear it often anymore. It had become less of an accessory and more of a symbol she protected until someone else earned it. Her speech was short but unforgettable. There is no expiration date on wisdom. And no family should treat its matriarch like an outdated asset in need of quiet liquidation. The moment we begin valuing reverence over reverence, we lose not just our elders, but our compass. The room erupted in applause, but the moment that stayed with her most wasn't the crowd. It was seeing Rebecca and Caroline sitting side by side, both clapping, both changed. In the months following the infamous wedding cancellation, the Sullivan women had begun a quiet reinvention. Rebecca no longer referred to herself as a socialite. She introduced herself as an advisor at the foundation. She mentored college students, gave talks on financial literacy for young women, and, when asked privately, would tell the story of how her own grandmother made her earn the inheritance of respect before anything else. Caroline, now volunteering at a local legal clinic for women in transition, found solace in humble service after decades of entitlement. It was not redemption, it was rebuilding. Margaret, for her part, had resumed teaching guest lectures on negotiation and ethics. Her syllabus included a case study titled "The Column Strategy: Reclaiming Space in Rooms That Forgot You Built Them." Students often asked if the story was real. She'd smile and say, "It was inspired by someone I used to underestimate, myself." The house on Beacon Hill remained her home, but its energy had shifted. No longer a stage for passive silences and dismissive glances, it now served as the Foundation's headquarters, buzzing with interns, alumni, and young women with bright eyes and sharper questions. Every hallway echoed not with footsteps of manipulation, but with purpose. And in her study, Margaret often found herself pausing beside the framed letter from Judge Sullivan, her late husband, who had once written, "A just courtroom listens to every voice, not just the loudest, but especially the one that has waited the longest to speak." One day, a letter arrived, handwritten, from a young woman in Montana who had read about the column story in a feature article. "Dear Miss Sullivan," it began, "I'm 23, newly graduated, and I watched my grandmother be erased by the people she raised. She died quietly last year, never speaking up. But your story, your courage, it gave me a new mission. I will not inherit silence. I will inherit strength." Margaret read it twice, then 3 times, before placing it beside the brooch in her drawer. In a world that often values novelty over nuance, she had proven that legacy isn't built in a weekend wedding. It's constructed over decades of earned wisdom, decisive boundary setting, and the courage to walk out of rooms where you're not respected, even if you built the doorframe. Her column had once hidden her. Now, it was the pillar others leaned on. And every time someone spoke up for themselves, an intern correcting a board member, a daughter questioning a tradition, a woman asking for a seat she had earned, Margaret Sullivan's story whispered behind the courage, "Don't just stand behind the column, become the architect of the room." She never raised her voice. She never sought revenge. She built something stronger, a life that could not be dismissed, erased, or edited out of the photograph. At a private brunch celebrating the Foundation's newest partnership with a women's leadership program, Margaret walked Rebecca through the gallery of portraits lining the hallway. "You know what's missing from most legacy conversations?" she asked softly. "Perspective. The young assume the view from the top is always granted, not realizing someone once laid the bricks for the floor they stand on." Rebecca nodded, no longer the girl who calculated inheritance totals behind a closed bedroom door, but a woman in formation, shaped by consequence and newly baptized in humility. She reached into her pocket and removed a small velvet pouch. "It's time," she said. Inside was the Sullivan brooch. "I want to earn it back, not wear it." Margaret smiled, taking it gently. "You don't earn it in a day. But this is a good start." Back home, Margaret opened her journal, volume 47, and wrote the final lines of what had become her personal case study. Column placement is irrelevant when you are the architect of the structure. Some will try to seat you in silence. Let them. Then cancel the table, the payment, the illusion, and rebuild. That afternoon, as she prepared for a lecture at Harvard, the same lecture hall she once thought she'd never return to, she chose not to bring the brooch. She didn't need symbols anymore. She was the symbol. Her entrance was quiet, no spotlight, no fanfare, but when she began speaking, the room fell into reverent silence. "Today's session is about reclaiming strategic space," she said, eye scanning rows of future lawyers, policymakers, and CEOs. "But I'll begin with a personal anecdote. I was once seated behind a column. It wasn't about poor planning. It was about how people see power, especially when that power is gray-haired, female, and refuses to fund ego." Laughter rippled through the room, but it quickly gave way to focused attention. Margaret continued, weaving the old with the new, the family betrayals with the foundations of justice. It wasn't about bitterness, it was about boundaries. Her story had gone viral months earlier, but the version told here, quiet, composed, and piercing, was the one they would remember. At the end, a young woman approached her. "Professor Sullivan, do you mind if I quote you in my thesis?" Margaret smiled. "Only if you understand the context. Justice isn't loud, it's structured, and structure can either be a cage or a platform, your choice." That evening, as Eleanor placed fresh flowers in the foyer, Margaret lingered at the grand piano, her late husband's pocket watch in hand. No regrets, no missed moments, just earned clarity. The dinner table was set again, this time for Sunday supper. Rebecca would bring Jackson, and Emily, the youngest Sullivan, was invited too. They wouldn't speak of trust funds or estate clauses. They'd speak of books, cities to travel to, and maybe the lecture Margaret had given. And if Emily ever asked about the famous story, the one about the wedding, the column, the vanished payments, Margaret would simply nod and say, "Yes, darling, that's the story, and it's also the blueprint." Because in the end, some columns are meant to hide you, but others are meant to be moved by you. The story of Margaret Sullivan teaches one of the most powerful, timely lessons for life in 2025. Never mistake silence for weakness, and never confuse age with irrelevance. In a world moving at digital speed, where the loudest often drown out the wisest, Margaret's story reminds us that legacy, respect, and authority must be actively protected, especially by those who've spent years being the backbone of family or institutions. Her experience underscores the critical need to set boundaries, emotionally, financially, and socially, especially when navigating dynamics with people who feel entitled to your history but dismissive of your voice. In a time where many elders are being gently sidelined under the guise of helping, often facing subtle forms of gaslighting or financial manipulation masked as concern, Margaret demonstrates what it looks like to reclaim narrative power with grace, precision, and structure. She didn't scream, she didn't argue, she planned, she documented, she acted with calculated dignity. In doing so, she reminded us that strategic restraint paired with decisive follow-through can be far more powerful than reactive emotion. For those living in 2025, a time marked by accelerated change and generational disconnects, her lesson is deeply relevant. Whether you are a parent, a professional, or simply someone aging in a culture that glorifies youth, you must take responsibility for how your value is perceived and preserved. This means keeping legal and financial affairs transparent and fortified. It means documenting intentions and being clear about consequences. But more than that, it means refusing to shrink to make others more comfortable. Applying this lesson to modern life involves having hard conversations about wills, estate planning, care expectations, and boundaries, not when crisis hits, but long before. It also means understanding the psychology of power. People will often exploit what you allow to go unchallenged. So if you're being positioned behind your own metaphorical column, whether in your workplace, family, or social circle, take a step back and ask, what role have I accepted that no longer serves who I am? And more importantly, how can I renegotiate my place without tearing the room down? In 2025, it's more vital than ever to live with intentional visibility. That doesn't require shouting, it requires showing up, authentically, unshrinkingly, and with the full record of what you've built, what you've given, and what you now require in return. For younger people watching this unfold, the lesson also cuts deep. Don't mistake your elders' stillness for senility or their generosity for permission. Margaret's granddaughter learned this only after consequences forced her into clarity. But the more elegant approach would be to recognize early that wisdom should be honored while it's still speaking, not memorialized once it's silent. True family, true teams, and true legacies are built on mutual respect and generational learning, not inheritance raids masked as concern. Margaret's story didn't end with revenge, it ended with transformation. She didn't just cut people off, she forced them to grow. And in doing so, she grew too. She reconnected with purpose. She redefined her role. She stopped being the checkbook behind the scenes and returned to being the architect of her influence. That's the goal for any of us, regardless of age, to know when you're being erased and choose instead to reframe the entire portrait. So in 2025, whether you're 28 or 78, ask yourself, what columns are you standing behind? And what would it take to reclaim your seat, not just at the table, but at the head of it? The answer lies not in bitterness, but in blueprint. Margaret showed us how to write one. Now it's our turn to follow it.